Good morning, everybody. What a lovely morning. Thank you, Ben. The reading today is from Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. And I'll be reading from the King James Version of the Bible. Wherefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Christ Jesus, who was faithful to him that appointed him, as also Moses was faithful in all his house. For this man was counted worthy of more glory than Moses, inasmuch as he who hath builded the house hath more honour than the house. For every house is builded by some man, but he that built all things is God. And Moses verily was faithful in all his house, as a servant, for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken after. But Christ, as a son over his own house, whose house are we, if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm unto the end.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see all of you here this morning, and wonderful to be able to gather together this morning and to share in this time with one another. The letter to the Hebrews shows us the greatness of Christ over everything that has gone before. We've already seen the greatness of Christ's word over the words of the prophets who had gone before in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In many and various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by a Son. And we've also seen the superiority of Christ over the angels in chapter 1, verses 4 to 14, where the writer was telling us that the angels are created beings who worship the eternal Son. Well, now here in chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, the writer shows us the superiority of Christ over one of the great characters of the Bible, that is Moses. The writer shows us how Jesus is greater than Moses, and why it is that Jesus we should focus upon and not upon Moses. To understand this passage, we must understand how the Jews regarded Moses. To the Jews, Moses occupied a unique place in their history. He was a great leader of God's people. He was the prototype of the prophets who were to come. He was a worker of miracles. He was a writer, and he was a lawgiver. Moses' life and influence is summarized in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 10 to 12, which tells us, and there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him, for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. There is no doubt that Moses is a great character, and his story is an inspiring one. He was born into a Hebrew family in Egypt at a time when his people were being cruelly persecuted and exploited by Pharaoh. To save his life, his mother placed him in a basket and set him on the river. And of all the people who could have found him, he was found by Pharaoh's daughter, who took him and brought him up as her own son in the royal family. He was educated in the wisdom of the Egyptians and had access to the great wealth of that nation. Yet he never forgot his origins and his identity as a Hebrew, and he was distressed to see their suffering. When he was 40 years old, he killed an Egyptian who he saw beating a fellow Hebrew. For the next 40 years, he lived in exile in Midian, working as a shepherd for his father-in-law. And while there, God appeared to him in a burning bush and called him to lead his people out of Egypt. Moses didn't want to go, but there was no escape from the task that God had called him to. So he returned to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and to demand the release of the people of Israel. When Pharaoh refused to let the people go, God used Moses to bring the plagues upon Egypt, which destroyed that country. And finally, following the death of the firstborn sons in Egypt, Pharaoh allowed Moses and the people of Israel to leave. Moses spent the next 40 years leading the people of Israel through the wilderness to bring them to the verge of entry into the land that God had promised to give them. During that time, Moses had to contend with the murmuring and the complaining, grumbling of the people as they rebelled against God's directions. On Mount Sinai, he received God's law, which he communicated to the people, the law that would direct their lives and shape them into God's nation. He gave them God's plan for the building of the tabernacle as a place of worship. He gave them God's instructions concerning the sacrifices and the offerings they were to make and the establishment of the priesthood. And then, just as the people were about to reach their goal of the promised land, God said that Moses would not be allowed to enter because of a sin he had committed earlier. He could go up to the mountain and he could look across the Jordan to see that land, but he would not be allowed to enter. And there on the eastern side of the river Jordan, God took Moses' life, and he was buried outside of the land in an unmarked grave in an unknown location. The story of Moses is one that has had a great influence, not only upon the Jews and the nation of Israel, but upon many others also, from artists to politicians. Michelangelo was inspired to produce a great sculpture of Moses that has shaped our mental image of what he may have looked like. He's been the subject of many films, from Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments to the more recent animated version of The Prince of Egypt. The story of Moses has inspired those who have fought and campaigned for their own liberation from oppression, from the French Revolution in the 18th century to the civil rights movement in the USA in the 1960s. Martin Luther King drew on the life of Moses in his last sermon when he said, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he has allowed me to go up the mountain, and I have looked over, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you." And a few hours later, Martin Luther King was dead, not having reached that promised land. Leader, lawgiver, prophet, miracle worker, writer, these were all roles that were fulfilled by Moses. Moses was a great man, but he was also human. He made mistakes. He sinned, and the Bible is honest in telling us about these things too. The Jews perhaps preferred a cleaned up version of his life, elaborated by various myths and legends. But in Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, the writer wants to put the record straight, and whilst acknowledging the greatness of Moses, he shows that Jesus Christ is greater. And to turn away from Christ and to go back to Moses, as these readers were thinking about doing, would be a grave mistake. The writer begins this passage by addressing his readers as holy brethren who share in a heavenly calling. Christians are brethren, brothers and sisters in Christ, who have been made holy or sanctified or set apart. And as such, we share in a heavenly calling, a calling that originates from God in heaven, a calling that is calling us to heaven. And as God called his people out of Egypt, so now God calls us out of this world to be different, to be set apart by him for his purpose. The readers are encouraged to consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. The New International Version translates this as, "Fix your thoughts on Jesus." We're not to give Jesus just a fleeting thought, someone who just pops into our minds and then out again, but we're to give him our full attention, with our minds and our thoughts fixed, focused upon him. And the Jesus that we are to fix our thoughts on is called here the apostle and high priest of our confession. This is the only place in the New Testament where Jesus is called an apostle. The word apostle means one who is sent on a mission. Jesus often spoke of himself being sent on a mission, sent into this world by the Father. In John chapter 5 and verse 37, he said, "And the Father who sent me has himself borne witness to me." And in John chapter 6 verse 29, he told the people, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." Jesus is the apostle because he was sent into the world by the Father to accomplish his mission. The writer also calls Jesus the high priest of our confession. He's already spoken of Jesus in chapter 2 verse 17 as a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God. As perfect man and perfect God, Jesus is uniquely qualified to be our high priest, the one through whom we can come to God. It is Jesus, the apostle and high priest, whom we confess when we publicly acknowledge him and we give him our undivided allegiance. And the writer continues to speak of Jesus here when he says of him, "He was faithful to him who appointed him." It was God the Father who appointed Jesus to be the apostle and high priest. And Jesus was faithful to his appointment. He fulfilled and he completed the work that the Father had sent him to do. Jesus' whole life was devoted to doing the will of the one who had sent him. And so finally on the cross he could say, "It is finished." His mission was accomplished there and then. It is at this point that the writer introduces Moses to show the similarity between Jesus and Moses. Jesus was faithful to the one who appointed him, and the writer says, just as Moses also was faithful in God's hands. Like Jesus then, Moses was faithful in discharging the responsibilities that God had given him in his house. The house refers to the community of God's people, or the household of God's people. God had chosen Moses for the task of leading the people of Israel out of Egypt, taking them to the promised land. And although he had initially been reluctant and aware of his own weaknesses and limitations, Moses had faithfully fulfilled those duties. When the writer speaks here of Moses' faithfulness in God's house, he is alluding to an incident that is recorded in Numbers chapter 12, verses 1 to 8. Here Moses' brother Aaron and his sister Miriam complained that Moses was not the only one that God had spoken through, that God had spoken through them as well. Well, that may have been true, but the special relationship that Moses had with God is seen in God's reply to their complaint. God says to them, "Hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" In defending Moses, God says, "He is faithful in all my house." God had entrusted his house, his people, to the care of Moses, and Moses had been faithful in carrying out those duties. And so the similarity between Jesus and Moses is to be seen in that they were both faithful to the task that God had given them. But now a contrast is drawn between Jesus and Moses in verse 3 of our reading. The writer says, "Yet Jesus has been counted as worthy of as much more glory than Moses, as the builder of a house has more honor than the house." When Moses had been speaking with God face to face, his face shone with the glory of God. Exodus chapter 34 verse 29 says that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, as he came down from the mountain, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. He was the man with the shiny face. Moses had to cover his face with a veil because this was a reflected, transitory glory that faded away once Moses had left the presence of God. There was a glory for Moses, but the writer to the Hebrews says that Jesus has been counted worthy of as much more glory than Moses. The distinction between the glory of Jesus and the glory of Moses is illustrated here through the builder and the building. Jesus is worthy of more glory than Moses, the writer says, as the builder of a house has more honour than the house. We may be impressed when we look at the splendour and the glory of a great building such as St. Paul's Cathedral, but the building is really just the reflection of the architect, the one who designed it, the one who built it. And when we look at St. Paul's Cathedral, we see in it the glory of Sir Christopher Wren, the one who designed it. The building reflects his skill and his ability. And the point that the writer is making here is that Moses was not the builder of the house, but he was part of the house himself. It is Jesus who is the builder, and therefore he is deserving of greater honour and glory than Moses himself. And then this comparison continues in verses 5 and 6. The writer says, "Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant." In Numbers chapter 12, verse 7, God refers to Moses there as "my servant Moses." And the writer tells us that Moses was a faithful servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. Moses was a prophet who would testify to the things that would happen later. In John chapter 5 and verse 46, when he was in a dispute with the Jews, Jesus said, "If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me." And in Luke chapter 24, verse 27, when Jesus spoke to those two disciples, those disheartened disciples on the road to Emmaus, we're told that beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. The coming of Jesus was something that had been spoken of by Moses. And in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, Moses said to the people, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brethren, him you shall hear." Those words of Moses, the faithful servant, were fulfilled in the coming of Jesus. He was that prophet whom Moses had predicted would come. The writer then has demonstrated how Moses was a faithful servant in God's house, but in contrast, he says that Christ was faithful over God's house as a son. Moses was a faithful servant in God's house, but Jesus was a faithful son over God's house. Moses was in God's house as a member of that household, as one of God's people, but Jesus is over God's house with the authority he has as the head of that house. The other contrast we see here is the contrast between a servant and a son. Moses was a servant, Jesus was a son. And so the difference between Moses and Jesus here is one of their status. As a son over God's house, then, Jesus is greater than Moses, who is a servant in God's house. And so by means of this contrast between the two, the writer has demonstrated the greatness of Jesus over Moses. He concludes here with this application. He says, and we are God's house if we hold fast our confidence and pride in our hope. We, the church, are God's house. This is not about a physical building, but it's about people who are members of God's family, God's household. As Peter also says in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, like living stones, be yourselves built into a spiritual house. Church is a household, a family of God's people, a spiritual building bound together in Christ. But there is a condition imposed here. The writer says that we are God's house if we hold fast our confidence and pride in our hope. We can have a great confidence in our relationship with God. We can have pride in our hope of heaven. It is this confidence and pride which we must hold fast to if we are to remain as God's house. Moses was a great man. He was a faithful servant who had a special relationship with God. But like all great men, Moses was less than Christ. It is Jesus who is greater, because he is a faithful son over God's house. And therefore, may we be encouraged to keep our thoughts and our minds focused upon Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, the faithful son over God's house, the one who is worthy of much more glory than Moses. And with our minds focused upon Jesus, we can hold fast our confidence and our pride in our hope. Thank you for listening this morning, and may God bless you.